Okay, recording in progress. Great. Okay. So thank you all. We're going to continue our story that we began last week. Anybody, Michael, was here? Anyone else? You watched it? Okay. So last week we told the story of the emergence of kind of the modern American Jewish denominations. The conservative movement and the Orthodoxy really separate and have distinct identities only in the 40s and 50s. And in the United States, the Mechitza was the dividing line, as it were, between the two movements. And we suggested the theory that it was because Mechitza was something easy to be that could be adjudicated by the courts, since it was like a judge could rule on whether or not a shul did or did not have mixed eating, whereas other criterions of orthodoxy, the civil courts were not going. When people sued their synagogue for violating the synagogue's bylaws, the judges were not going to weigh in onto whether the rabbi was saying heretical ideas or not, or whatever it was. But whereas the mechitza was something that could easily be adjudicated. Nonetheless, in the aftermath of these, as the dust settles in 1950s and 60s, and Orthodoxy is clearly distinct from conservative Judaism and obviously from Reform Judaism in the United States. The distinction between the observance of the rabbis and Orthodox conservative rabbis were similarly observant in the 50s and 60s, and their congregants were similarly non-observant in the 50s and 60s. Okay, most people who went to Orthodox synagogues in the 60s were not Shomer Shabbos. Okay, that is, for example, this is one standard. Okay, there's a line during the first half of the 20th century. If and when an American Jew attended a synagogue, he or she most likely prayed and socialized in an Orthodox house of worship. However, most of these Orthodox synagogue goers, drawn from among the masses of Eastern European Jews and their children, who then constituted the majority of American Jews, were not especially punctilious in their adherence to the demand and requirements of Jewish law. Okay, that's the line from Jeffrey Gurok. I will share the source sheet now. I'm going to tell because I'm reluctant to share because I want to tell a story. I'm going to tell 5 stories. Okay, I'm going to tell. So I'm reluctant to sort of. I'll give you the source sheet. Just don't look ahead. Okay, you'll ruin the suspense. Okay. Okay. We can pass these out, and I will share with you guys online. Here it is. No, you can look just this front. Just look. Don't look ahead. You can look ahead. Yeah, you can look ahead. You can. Yeah. Okay. All right. And here you go. You have it on chat. Okay. So there's. Okay. So just look at some dates here. You got. Okay. You got it. Not looking. Yeah. So okay. What can I tell you? Okay. You can look at the first. You can look at the first page. That's okay. So look at some dates here. 1937, the Ramaz School in Manhattan is established. Rabbi Wolkenfeld is one of the first students. His father established the school in part so he could attend. 1937, Maimonides School is founded in Brookline by Rabbi Soloveitchik. Very important sort of early day school. 1941, the Telz Yeshiva opens in Cleveland. We had moved there from Telz, of course. 1943, Beis Medrash Gavoha established in Lakewood by Varon Cutler Zatzal, who was chose Lakewood because there was like nothing there. It was chicken farms in 1943, and he just wanted to have a yeshiva in an environment where there'd be no distractions and could just be a pure, yeshiva town. I don't know if you've been to Lakewood recently. It's one of the largest cities in New Jersey at this point, and it's like an Orthodox metropolis. It's sort of incredible. 1944, the Torah Masorah is founded. That's the National Society for Hebrew Day Schools. Between 1948 and 1963, you have 14 all-girls high schools open. In the 60s, girls are 40% of the day school population. The early impetus for day schools was people wanted to give their sons Jewish educations. The daughters getting Jewish educations lagged somewhat. Do you know how to? So yeah, it's the same. And between 1950 and the door, okay, between 1950 and 1970. We have Orthodoxy declines to more than 50% of American Jewry to approximately 11%. It's basically been around 11% ever since. So you have this growth of day schools in the 60s and 50s, 60s, and 70s. At the same time that Orthodoxy is declining in its percentage of American Jewry. But what's happening is that those who remain in Orthodox synagogues in 1960 or 1970, let's say, versus 1950, are those who are the committed observant core. So by and large, the immigrants and children of immigrants who were not especially observant, but went to their local Orthodox shul in 1940, 1950. The older generation died off. The younger generation moved out to the suburbs and were much less likely to affiliate with an Orthodox shul unless they were themselves personally observant and committed to Orthodoxy in their private life. Obviously, that's generality. That's not, you still have plenty of, non-observant, people who drive through their Orthodox shuls on Shabbat, for example, that still exists, but much less than it used to be. I heard, hear stories of, someone told me recently, his father was a rabbi of a shul in the Bronx so I guess on Yom Kippur afternoon, they would open like a Yizkor only service, 30 minutes in like the shul basement, and people would line up around the block to go in and like say Yizkor and go out. Like they weren't, there for the whole day. Maybe they were working also, but they couldn't miss Yizkor. And they went to their local Orthodox shul to do that, right? That was that is much less common, that kind of deep sense of being of attachment and devotion to being at your local Orthodox shul, or seeking out an Orthodox shul is much less common on those who aren't actually Orthodox. But those who remain were the committed core, and day school education is a big part of that. That the story that our community tells itself is that once we pivoted to day school education, that's when we began to retain our youth. That was the key to raising a generation of American-born Jews who would emulate and retain the religious commitments of their parents. That we sort of failed for a generation or two without day schools, and once we switched to day schools, that's when we were able to maintain that success. Story in the Gemara here in Bava Batra, which is on the kind of Torah we'll learn together. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Baram, Zechor Torah Ish Latov. Remember that man for good. Yeshua ben Gamla Shmo. His name is Yeshua ben Gamla. She'il Malehu Nishtachach Torah Misra. Were it not for Yeshua ben Gamla, the Torah would be forgotten from Israel. Well, how is that? Misheyesh Lo'av Milam Torah Misheyesh Lo'av Lo Haya Lamed Torah. Someone who had a father to teach him. His father would teach him Torah. If someone didn't have a father or didn't have a father who could teach him Torah, he would never learn any Torah at all. My Darush, what did Yeshua ben Gamla, what was his drasha? What did he learn? How did he read the Torah? You shall learn them. You shall sorry, not they, not he, they interpreted my Darush, they interpreted the Deuteronomy 11 to mean you shall teach them to your children, meaning the obligation of Torah education is an obligation of fathers to their sons. It's not, and no one else. So if the father's not around, the kid doesn't learn Torah. No one else is responsible other than the father. So what did he say? Let's have schools in Yerushalayim for people who don't have fathers. My Jerush, what was that based on? The Torah should come forth from Zion. So for that to happen, we need schools in Zion. So there's schools, but who's going to bring them to the school? You need a father to bring the child to the school. If the father's not there, he's not going to bring, no one's going to bring the kid to the school. So what do you do? So Yeshua ben Gamla, Kinu sheyesh meshivim b'chol plach uplach. V'machazino keven sheish esrei keven shva esrei. Sorry, we'll pause. So he would say, let's have schools in every city. So you don't need the initiative of the parent to bring the child to Yerushalayim to study Torah. Every city should have its own school. So at 16 or 17 years old, these youths would go and study Torah in their local school as established by Yeshua ben Gamla. However, Mishaya Rabo Koesalav Mavit Bo, what happens? 16-year-old, 16, if you remember what's to be 16, you're very hot-headed. And so people who, the rabbi or the teacher would get angry and would chastise the student, and the student would get up and storm out. And that wasn't a very effective way of learning. So what happened? Ad Shabai Yeshua ben Gamla Vit. So Yeshua ben Gamla, he comes at the end, actually, of this series of progressions of Jewish education, and he established Shayu Moshivim Melamdei Tinakot V'chol Medina Medina V'chol Ir V'ir Machnisino Tan Kiven Sheish Kiven Sheva. Every city, big city, small city, every town in Israel should have a school. There should be teachers of young children there, and the children should start their Jewish education at the age of 6 or 7, so that they're still, they're not going to get angry at their teachers and storm out. Okay. Okay, beautiful story. Okay, this is long time before the American public school education, right? Yeshua ben Gamla has this idea: schools in every city, start at a young age, and this comes up in Bava Batra in the context of zoning regulations that you are not allowed and non-compete clauses and that you can always have more teachers. Okay, that this is part of this takana that you can always open up a competing school. Okay, it's sort of it's a public good, objectively. That's the context there in Bava Batra. So this should be like a very nice story for the American Day School movement. We also have schools now, and this seems to be necessary. You don't need to have the most committed parents, right, in order to ensure that the kids get enough Jewish education to equip them to be Jewishly committed adults and to make their own Jewish choices. However, what's different about Yeshua ben Gamliel's Takana and the American Day School system? How's it not quite the same? Okay, so first of all, we don't know the curriculum in Yeshua ben Gamliel's school. It probably didn't include computer science or biology. Fine, the Seder. There's another important difference between his system and our system, I think. Who's paying for Yeshua ben Gamliel's schools? Seems to be a public responsibility. That there's no tuition, right? Tuition would undermine the entire point. The whole point was that in the bad old days, the motivated parents would ensure their children received a Jewish education. Yeshua ben Gamliel said, no, every community needs a school so that every child gets an education. It seems, I think, the plain sense of his takana is that Jewish schools were a obligation of Jewish communities, and Jewish communities paid for Jewish schools. Whereas the American Day School system is parents pay for their own kids' education, which is the opposite of Yeshua ben Gamliel's system, right? It sets up it's an enormous financial burden for many parents, and even though the many generous donors subsidize the cost for those who need, it's still it's a tremendous burden, right? I think, and you can speak to your local day school parent to discuss that burden. It's not just a financial burden. I think it's a moral burden, right? You don't really you have very wealthy people who have to ask for tzedakah, and it puts them in a really impossible bind of not knowing. I remember the first year I filled out for my first financial aid, request form when our kids started the day school system. The question that was the hardest to answer was how much can you afford to pay, which was essentially asking how many times you're going to will your kids visit their grandparents? How many times will they, right? Like that's sort of what they're essentially asked, which is an impossible question to answer. I think a very, very hard question to answer. And so every financial decision made by otherwise financially independent adults is then subject to that kind of internal scrutiny. And if you, right, and I think it puts people in an impossible bind. So it's I think a very hard, and it has furthermore distorts our community insofar as young people know that in order to be a member in standing of modern Orthodox community, you need to be able to come up with tuition to pay for your kids' day school education, your future potential children's day school education, which distorts the careers that people consider in our community, right? Modern Orthodox Jews know they can't be artists. They probably can't be academics. They can't write. They can live with challenges, right? Like it's just people. So the whole community is distorted by that kind of financial, and people also are incentivized to cut corners on their and taxes, et cetera, the number of children they have as well. Exactly. Yeah. Puts a burden on women who want to stay home with their young children. That's the kind of parents they want to be, but they feel pressure to work, not to, yeah. And men and women are working maybe more hours than they want to, don't have the time to be with their children and enjoy their family life in the way, right? This is not the system. This is not like the Talmud tells us it's not supposed to be this way. The Talmud tells us Jewish community, right? According to the Talmud, you would pay, like if you're, every member of the Jewish community would contribute very, very generously every year to support their local day school, whether they had children or not, whether their children were in school or out of school or not yet in school, right? Everyone would pay according to their ability. And that's how the schools would function. Now, we have universal education, for K through 12, right? That obviously didn't exist in pre-modern times. So the burden is certainly larger than anything that, you should, I think, in pre-modern times, a 10-year-old would be like, all right, you're off to work now, okay? Like, except for the few who showed real intellectual promise, people's education ended rather young, and they would apprentice in a craft or go to work. But as a basic financial model, the system we have today is really the opposite of like the traditional Jewish model of how Jewish education is supposed to work, and all of the negativity and the way it distorts our community is like It doesn't have to be that way. It shouldn't be that way. It's because we're are funding our Jewish schools in the opposite way of what the Talmud tells us they should be funded. Right? There should be no tuition. Okay, according to that's the whole point. That's the whole point of Shuv and Gamliel. Were it not for him, the Torah would be forgotten. There should be no tuition. So just as this one posek who's sensitive to these sort of economic kind of dynamic. This is a Shuv from David Tzvi Hoffman, who was leading posek in Germany until his death in 1921. A very, very interesting posek. He was also he had a PhD. He taught Jewish history a little bit and published some articles in Jewish history, but he was the senior posek, senior halachic scholar of Berlin Orthodoxy. And here's the question: Sheilak tanim shelchim lebeit hasefer hanikra gymnasium lumod sham chochmot hatrichot bezmanenu leparnasa v'olchim sham gam b'yom hashabbat v'olchim imahem sfrehem tatrichim lulamod chayav ha'av limchot b'v'nav ola. Right, they're going to bring their school books with them on Shabbos when they go to the gymnasium, which is the schools that we need in our day in order to earn a living. You need a secular education to earn a living. These are the schools that teach them. The schools are open on Shabbos as well. So how does that work? The parents have to that's the phrasing. Like, here's his answer. Gymnasium. So first I'm going to answer the question of, can the kids go to gymnasium on Shabbat? V'hine, it says in Archaim, two opinions in Shulchan Aruch about that relevant to this question. So there are two opinions in the Shulchan Aruch about whether one can study non-Jewish books and non-Jewish wisdom on Shabbat. He quotes a strict opinion, quotes a lenient opinion. Okay, so even though you would think the rules of reading the Shulchan Aruch would suggest we should be strict. You're not allowed to read secular books or papers or materials on Shabbat. Nonetheless, these other Achronim say that we're lenient, and even those who are strict would be lenient here and permit going to gymnasium because it's a little bit of a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah is, you need to be able to have a livelihood and support yourself. That's a mitzvah. The education you need to be able to be a financially independent adult is attained by going to these schools on Shabbat, and therefore, it's a bit of a mitzvah, even for those who'd be otherwise strict about reading secular books on Shabbos. The Yidju Bizman Hazet Yef Shar L'Socher L'Hasik Parnasato Im Lo Lamad Tchila L'Shonot V'Chachmot B'Bate Sefer Nikrim Gymnasium or real shul. Okay, you can't earn a parnasa, you can't earn a living without this type of education. V'Init Patel Talmid B'Limudo B'Yom HaShabbat Azai Lo Yavin Gam Mash Lamed B'Chol. All right, if you don't go to school on Shabbos, you won't understand what they teach you on Monday morning. Okay, you'll be behind. He's not going to reteach the lesson to the Jewish kids that he taught on Shabbos morning. He's not going to do that. They're going to fall farther and farther behind their Gentile classmates. Why can't the Jewish parents hire a tutor to teach their kids Saturday night or on Sunday what they missed in gymnasium on Saturday? That seems like a good solution. Why can't they do that? Rov Yisrael Bevantin Rabbeinu Aniyim. Most Jews can't afford that. V'kevan jehalimud hu hachanu leparnasa b'vadai nechshav lemitzvah echat mutar aliba Okay, and so they can't afford that, and since this education is necessary for earning a living, it's a bit of a mitzvah. Everyone agrees it's fine. But od ani omer yesh mekamot jafilu mi shedo masayet liskor lo melamed shechzor im bano mashu yitel b'shabbat yoter tov oseh im sholech et bano lebeit. This should be underlined. Okay, I'm sorry, it's not. I'm going to say furthermore. This is I think so radical, so counter to our ethos. Even in places where somebody has enough money to hire a tutor to teach his child what he missed by staying home on Shabbos from not going to school, it's better he should send his kid to school on Shabbos. Why is that? Because the poor kids have to do that. Sorry, let's skip the line. So better send your kids to school on Shabbos so that there'll be a greater critical mass of Shomer Shabbos kids who won't write. if the wealthy parents keep their kids out of school and hire private tutors, then only the poor kids will be in school on Shabbos. There won't be so many of them, and they won't have like enough like critical mass reinforcement from their classmates to refrain from writing. So let's all send all the Jewish kids to school, to our public schools on Shabbos, so that there'll be like a nice group of from kids in school on Shabbos, and they'll reinforce one another and they won't write. But if the wealthy pull out and arrange for this private education for their kids, so they don't have to go to school on Shabbos, then there'll be only a fraction of the community will be in school, and they're going to succumb to the peer pressure and they're going to write on Shabbos. So it's like we're going to, I think it's an incredible sensitivity to, right? We're not going to impose a religious burden that the entire community can't afford. Because if we do that, then we're just going to basically write the poor out of our community. They're going to write on Shabbos. They'll be lost. So let's send everyone to this more challenging environment, but at least that way they'll be, sorry, Jordan asked what year was this written? Carly asked when was this written? So I don't know, I don't have a year. He died in 1921, and this was written in Germany. Okay, so Germany sometime before 1921. So this is
clearly they were with non-Jewish students too,
yeah,
right?
yeah. They're going to this is a local public. This was exactly send our kids to a public school because we can't because the other model, right, which is like this private model of we'll send our kids to public school, but we'll hire a tutor so they don't have to be there on Shabbos. That's too expensive, and we can't impose a burden. And if we impose that, like it's not too expensive for everyone. It's not too expensive. It's too some people could afford that, but not everyone could. And so that would divide the community along class lines. And that would just lead, and we can't abandon those who are poor to like say that they're going to be written out of the community. They won't be able to maintain the standards. We can't have standards that, right? Again, it's the opposite of the, right? Because I think that most day schools in many locations, they're competing, modern Orthodox day schools, they're competing not only against some of the fanciest public schools in the country, they're also competing against the really fancy prep schools for some of their student body. And so they need the fancy computer labs and the counselors and the this and the that and all the latest bells and whistles and the small class sizes because they're competing not against, they're competing against the best of the best schools. And so everyone then has to somehow afford that model in order to like get into the system. In order to be a modern Orthodox Jew, you need to be able to spend $25,000 to $35,000 to $40,000 a year per child post-tax money because like the education that our community says is necessary to be part of our community is an education that competes with the finest schools in the country. So that's one counter argument. Okay, this story of the day school movement saved American Jewry is that the day school movement is counter to like the Jewish ethos and is actually creating a lot of it's like a ticking time bomb. We have an unsustainable financial model. It's already distorting the community in that people are incentivized to cheat on taxes and cheat on business to steal a lot of money to afford this lifestyle. And it also distorts the community by people feeling they have to be, fancy pants attorneys and, physicians with lucrative specialties in order to like have a leg and be part of our community. Okay. I'll give a second counter story. What else was happening in America during the decades when the day school movement was rising that was also sending millions and millions of children out of public schools to private schools? Okay, this is the era of desegregation. Okay, Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. Supreme Court comes back with additional rulings as they get more and more impatient at states and municipalities dragging their feet on integration, and you have busing ordered in many locations. The Christian right responds by creating evangelical schools all across the South and pulling hundreds of thousands of kids out of the public school system into these segregated private schools. And this is the era the Jewish community is doing the same. So the motivations are not necessarily racist, but the context in which the day school movement is expanding is the same years that public school education as a bedrock of American civic life is being eroded as the schools are desegregated. And that's also a timeline. There's an article a few years ago, somebody wrote an op-ed in the forward about this scholar whose dissertation was on Los Angeles, where she showed just the strong correlation between the rise of day schools in Los Angeles and desegregation efforts and busing efforts in. Okay, hold on. Let me read her. Okay. To date, Smith's dissertation is the only intensive work of scholarship on the intersection between the desegregation of public schools and the rise of Jewish day schools. But Rivka Press-Schwartz, a research fellow at the Shalom Harvard Institute of North America and associate principal of Riverdale's SCR High School, is sure that the pattern Smith identified in LA was replicated across the country. There was a great deal of evidence of people moving to the suburbs, pulling their kids out of public school and putting them in private schools, Schwartz said. It's 100% true that Jewish parents then and now cared about their kids' Jewish education and sacrificed to afford their kids a meaningful Jewish education. But it can also be true that if your neighborhood public school is all of a sudden about to be subject to busing, then sending your kid to a Jewish school might appeal more. In addition, I think the fact that so many Americans living in the same neighborhoods as Jews were sending their kids to private school also undermined the sense that to be a good American is to send your kid to public schools, which I think was the ethos of the early generations of Jewish immigrants to America. Public school education was seen as like core to what this country is about and how to be a good American, how to be a good citizen. And when your neighbors all of a sudden are sending their kids to private schools within the context of desegregation and suburbanization, right? So it would seem easier for Jews to be susceptible to that argument as well. So it's not, this is not that this was not ascribing anyone racist motivations, not saying this was even like the, conscious awareness on many people, but it is certainly a context for this pivot of our community from public school education to parochial school education. Is that, you want to respond or?
Hi there. I'm not saying that people didn't pull their kids out of public school and put them in day schools for that reason. But in the community I'm from and the community that I live in now, the vast majority of people voted with their feet. They didn't stay in their present communities and just send their kids to day schools or private schools. They left. And that is absolutely true in St. Louis. It's for the growth. Part of it is attributable to the baby boom. I mean, Jews had lots of babies just like everyone else. So if you look at the growth of suburban school districts, you'll see that it kind of peaked in the early 70s or mid 70s as that baby boom wave hit. And so, I'm not saying it did. What I was always upset about in my community growing up was that more people didn't avail themselves of day school as opposed to moving. Instead, they moved, and you know that. So, and I see the same patterns here. I mean, there was a whole neighborhood called Briggs Park, which isn't very far from here and from what was the academy on 16th Street. Those kids, that community just picked up and left and moved to Campbell. So anyway, so I would love to see statistics that prove this, but that's not been my.
Okay, cool. Okay, thank you. So let's look at some numbers. I don't have historical data. I do have data from 2018. Okay, so we can pass that around. The Avichai Foundation used to do these. I'll share with you guys online too. Which of these tabs? Okay, here we go. Yeah. Okay. See if this works. See if this works. Okay. The Avichai Foundation used to do like an annual census of day school students, which involved like an actual, they called like every little, Hasidic shtibel and in Williams, and how many kids are there in first grade, how many in second, and they used that to compile data when they compared from year to year what the day school population was. So really not by, it's like it was a very rigorous effort. They don't do this anymore, but so I have a few pages. I think it's kind of cool. As you can see, enrollment data by grade and by type of school. So, modern Orthodox third graders, 2,287. Okay, like it's very, very, very specific. And you can see, right? And that's sort of, I don't know, it's a good like way to have a sense of the size of our community. Like there are less than 2,000 graduates of modern Orthodox high. You can assume some modern Orthodox kids go to public school, some go to non-Orthodox Jewish day schools, and you can assume there are some non-Orthodox kids going to modern Orthodox high schools. But as like a general order of magnitude, your cohort, right? If you're like, how many kids are graduating from modern Orthodox high school? Like what is the cohort of 18 new modern Orthodox adults each year? It's between 1,500 and 2,000. They could all fit in this building. Okay.
In what geographic?
I think there's in North America or no, United States.
United States?
Yes. Yeah. That's smaller than you thought, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Hasidic is big. every, and there are Hasidic numbers are well, it's 11,000 5-year-olds in the Hasidic schools, and 3,700 Hasidic 12th graders. So 3,700 new Hasidic adults every year, turning 18. Which means which means that the Hasidic community has even like a 10% attrition rate. That's 300 or 400 Jews every year, which is probably as in terms of non-Orthodox Jews with like deep Jewish educations, Hebrew literacy, Yiddish fluent, it like dwarfs any other Jewish educational initiative in the country, right? Just the Hasidic attrition, if that, 400 a year, right? If that's just, if it's a 10% attrition rate. So it's sort of interesting in terms of just the scale of those numbers. And then the next pages, you can see the change between this is 1998 through 2018. So it's a 10-year period. You can see where the growth is occurring and where there's shrinkage, right? So you can see these like immigrant schools that taught a lot of Russians are kind of shrinking, which makes sense. They came in the 90s as that population integrates, like there's less of a need for those special schools catering to them. You see the Solomon Schechter movement is imploding. Many of those schools switched to being community day schools, so that's maybe okay, but
House conservative?
Solomon Schechter was the jewel in the crown of the conservative. Solomon Schechter School and Camp Ramah were the jewels in the crown of the conservative movement for generations. They were some of the best day schools in the country in certain topics, in certain subjects, and they're rapidly shrinking. Although some of them are becoming community day schools and are just rebranding and existing with slightly different labeling. Carly asked what's a modern Orthodox day school versus let's say centrist Orthodox, for example. And I don't know. I think generally the schools are pretty clear about which one is what. Well, I think modern Orthodox schools might be co-ed. Centrist Orthodox schools generally aren't. In terms of the number of hours, maybe of general studies versus Jewish studies, that might be a difference. I think there might be some schools where it's a bit gray and a little bit arbitrary in how it's determined, but yeah. And Carly's asking, how do schools students are in different? Yeah, well, yeah. So it's true. This is not, you're right, Carly. This is just a census of the schools. The schools have clear identities. The students, of course, don't, right? But like, let's assume that as a rough, scale of like the size of our community and different ages and et cetera, this is the best we got. Okay. Given all of those, you can have kids at all sorts of schools who believe and practice all sorts of ways and end up in all sorts of ways. Okay, so it's fun. This is all. I downloaded this from the internet. You could also download this from the internet, and maybe I saw Prisma, which is another Jewish educational they tried to they did like a less detailed survey a few years ago, but I don't think anyone's done this kind of work since Abikai has closed shop.
Consider Berman.
Berman is a modern Orthodox day school, I think. I don't think it's. I think Berman is, because it's I would imagine. Yeah, I would imagine in this scale in this rubric it would count as a modern Orthodox. Yeah.
In community schools, that's like kind of what is that?
Community school, it would be a school that is either non-denomination. I mean, there are different kinds of community day schools. There's some community day schools are multi-denominational and a little bit pluralistic, like Charles E. Smith here and some are like a school like Beth Tefillah, which is under Orthodox auspices, but with a very, very broad student body in terms of its own practices. So I think Beth Tefillah might also call itself. So they're sort of two very different kinds of schools, both of which call themselves community day schools. I think what they have in common is a very religiously diverse student body, and which they are really committed to maintaining. Okay, so what's another context of like what is it that shifted to enable Shabbos observance and observant? Like how did that observant core retain? How did Orthodoxy start being able to perpetuate its own religious commitments after generations of religious attrition? And the other context is, as we talked about this a few months ago, the labor movement. Okay, in 1886, the Haymarket riots in Chicago. What were they rioting about? They wanted a 5-day work week. Okay, 1908, the first American factory adopts a 5-day work week, and that was to accommodate Jewish employees. In 1919, there were massive strikes of unionized workers calling for an 8-hour workday. In 1938, thanks to President Roosevelt and a generation, really 2 generations, right? Really 3 generations of activism by the labor movement, the Fair Labor Standard Act creates a 5-day work week in 1938. Until then, you couldn't keep Shabbos in most professions in the United States. My cousin married a woman whose father or grandfather, maybe I'm getting the story, whatever okay. He had to find a new job every Monday because every Friday he was told, if you don't come back tomorrow, don't come back on Monday. So he found a new job every week and did this for years. Most people didn't do that, okay? The institution of the Hashkama minyan in American Orthodox synagogues was established for people who wanted to daven early Shabbos morning and then go to work in the garment, trades or in wherever, right, owning shops, whatever they did. The 9 o'clock Shabbos morning minyan was established by shuls to show, even though it's just kind of late, like it's after Sosvag Kriyat Shema, certain times of the year, but it was a way to show we're not going to work on Shabbos. So we're going to start our tefillot at 9 or 9:15 to show that we are not breaking Shabbos in our shul. Okay, unlike those others who, others who daven earlier. 1962, New York State ended its blue laws. Which then there was legislation protecting Sabbath observant civil servant exam takers, university students, etc. Fair Employment Practices Division of the federal government also assists in many states. You have the right to take university exams not on Shabbos, right? If in many states, and sort of the rise of America. So there are two strands. One strand is the history of like the labor movement earning the right to a 5-day work week, and the other strand is American multiculturalism, creating religious diversity, protections for religious diversity in the workplace and in higher education, and that enables Jews to keep Shabbos here. It was again in a way that was just not possible before. That's another context. So it really forces far larger than the Jewish community. But the Jewish community were active. There are a lot of Jews in the labor movement, of course, and played an active role in these struggles. But these were vast, vast struggles that that millions of Americans took part in that had initially nothing to do with us, and that enabled us to practice our religion in the United States in the second half of the 20th century. That's also an important story, I believe. Okay, questions, comments so far? I want to say something positive now about J schools. Okay, I want to say something positive. Okay, so here's what I think their value. I think their value and why they're so important in America is that I think day schools are a key to kind of democratic empowerment of Jews. That is to say, there are, in my opinion, to be an empowered Jew is somebody who can make his or her own religious choices and to have unmediated access to the wisdom and guidance of the Jewish tradition. But that's my definition of an empowered Jew. And that entails and requires a certain amount of textual literacy. And so the way to get that textual literacy is through just a certain number of hours of Jewish education, which is very hard to come by if you're not in a Jewish day school environment. And so I think that to me is like the value add. That's the value proposition of a Jewish day school, is just the literacy and comfort with Jewish wisdom and Torah sources, Hebrew language, to enable one to access the wisdom of Judaism in an unmediated way and to make decisions for oneself, again, about Jewish practice, right? Some people, right, can look up a question of Jewish practice in the Shulchan Aruch and read through with some commentaries on their own. And some people need someone to sit down and explain that for them. I think the former, first one, that's more empowered. And I think in the democratic culture of America, I think pushes us towards more people having that degree of empowerment over their own Jewish lives that I think can really come most authentically from having unmediated access to the Jewish library. So to me, that's the value add of a Jewish day school education. I think that's why it has been so important, specifically in the American context, which is democratic in a way that other Jewish communities in history have not been. However, I think that only works if the Jewish day schools prioritize Torah education and are clear and transparent about what their goals are. And I think it's very, I've been a parent in many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I don't know, many, many different schools. Some we loved a lot, some we loved a little. I think not one of them has ever very, very clearly said, this is what an 8th grade graduate of our elementary school, of our school should know when it comes to Jewish studies. Here's what a 12th grade graduate of our school, this is the knowledge and skills that they should, and obviously there's a curriculum in mathematics, there's a curriculum in, right? Like we because we transferred our 10th graders after night, whatever, like they missed geometry. So they have to take geometry. You got a letter saying that they wouldn't be able to graduate without taking geometry over the summer because the state of Maryland won't let them graduate without geometry. But there's no equivalent for how many Tosfot do they have to learn? Do they have to how fluent do they have to be in Rashi script? How many dapim of Gemara do they have to have learned? Right, right. Obviously, the state of Maryland doesn't care, but the schools could develop such an objective standard. And use that to kind of share with the community what they're about. And for whatever various reasons, I think some of them good reasons, but whatever, some of them not, I think that by and large, the schools have not done that. Several years ago, the Hadar Institute, in partnership with Beit Rabban, so non-Orthodox educational institute and a non-Orthodox community day school in New York, they developed curriculum standards K through 8 in Tefillah and Chumash and Torah Sheba'al Peh, maybe a few other areas as well. And they said, assuming that a day school has 15 hours a week of Hebrew and Judaics, here's what the kids should know at each grade. And I think that was trying to prompt a conversation that other schools should pick that up and say, we want to be accountable to the community in the content that we're providing. And again, for various reasons, I think I was like, my jaw dropped. I'd never seen a school be that specific about the content that they want their kids to know. And I still haven't seen it. But I did print out, it's also, you can find online, and I did print out, you can see the example of, yes.
It's also, I think, a very important psychological and social component of getting kids through those.
Those to share, yeah.
I think it's important that kids feel safe and comfortable with their Judaism, and that at a very young and easily influenced age, that they're not subject to the pressures of not a secular world, but a world without limits of Jewish law. And I know that as someone who went to day school through 9th grade, and then there was no girls' school, I went to public high school. And there was maybe 12 or 15 of us there, and we kind of stuck together for the first year, and then you kind of saw people socialize with mainly Jewish kids. But there were pressures to do things that you did not have when you were in a day school.
Where did you grow up? In
St. Louis.
Okay.
Same school.
A
little bit older.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that's all that. Yeah. Go ahead.
I know what school she's talking about. Most schools.
A couple questions. I mean, is part of the story also I don't know, the fragmentation of Judaism in the United States too, right? So that, in the 20th century is also when you have the growth, I think, of reform and conservative and sort of, different strands of Judaism. Yeah. And so there is, so where it used to be everybody went to Orthodox shul because that's what there was. Yeah. And so this is also
so there's one other piece. I'll tell you one other piece. There's another element too, and then I'll say yeah. All right. I always worry that I won't have enough things to say to fill my answer. Okay, here we go. A question from typically how many hours of Jewish education do non-Orthodox teach per week? So I think the 15 hours per week is basically that the Hadar standards assume is what you'll find in a typical dual curriculum non-Orthodox day school. So I think and I think some community schools do that many hours as well. Not all, but some do. I think that's so their standards assume that. Again, let me share it with you guys on what. Sorry, I forgot to share with you guys. It's all on the internet, folks. Okay, but I'll share. Here it is. You can look at it also. Okay. So the other piece, right? So the non-Orthodox movements were also growing. The conservative movement grew very, very rapidly in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, became to dominate American Judaism. One element that's sort of associated with conservative Judaism in mid-century years is their so-called, the quote-unquote driving tshuva that permitted driving to synagogues on Shabbat, but nowhere else, just a synagogue. I know I know one person who only drove to synagogue and not other places. But that was the position. Basic understanding that fueling the fire of an internal combustion engine for the sake of locomotion rather than for the sake of heat or light was a malacha she'ein shricha b'gufa, and therefore it was only an issur d'Rabbanan, and therefore it could be permitted for the sake of a mitzvah. That was their rationale. I don't think it's a very whatever. That was the rationale. It didn't change people's behavior, right? Nobody read nobody, but like very few people read the tshuva and now I'm going to start driving. They were driving before and they drove after. The difference is that it determined where the conservative synagogues could be built. And now you can't not drive to many conservative synagogues because they're built far away from where the housing is. And so they were driving before and they're driving after, but now if you want to walk, you couldn't do so in a conservative synagogue. And so you had in the 80s, for example, like many alumni of Camp Ramat, the other jewel in the crown of the conservative movement, who like fell in love with Shabbat at summer camp, couldn't continue that Shabbat observant at their local conservative synagogue because their local conservative synagogue was a drive away. And so the driving tshuva didn't impact people's behavior in the short term. It just, in the long term, I think had a really devastating impact on the ability to be a Shomer Shabbat attendee. I know, I have a friend who is a ordained conservative rabbi who was a professor. I don't want to tell too many addenda. Ordained conservative rabbi who attends his local Orthodox synagogue. He said there is a minion of ordained conservative rabbis who go to his local Orthodox synagogue because the conservative synagogue in the city where he lives was built in a region where just the housing isn't. Maybe somebody could live nearby, but not him and his colleagues. Obviously, it's not true everywhere. There are conservative synagogues in walkable neighborhoods that people can afford homes, etc. But in terms of like the story of America as a whole, that's very rare, and it's even true for, I think, conservative rabbis who don't drive on Shabbat. It's not always so easy for them to find employment because of where the synagogues that might employ them are located vis-a-vis the housing that's available in those regions. Like that's the story of suburbanization. That also, I think, sort of is a very big piece of why it is that the observant core ends up at Orthodox shuls. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's a good thing. As this stage of Jewish history comes to an end, Orthodoxy, although only 11%, has an 11% that is highly educated, highly committed, is willing to sacrifice for the sake of Torah and mitzvot and their Jewish identity. All very positive, tremendous strengths. What has been lost is, I'd say, just the chance to like be relevant to 90% of American Jewry who with no reason to step foot in Orthodox shul, wouldn't feel comfortable stepping foot in Orthodox shul. If they do, they wouldn't find, would they find, is there a kippah box by the door, right? If they don't come in with one already on their heads, or are pages announcements in the sidurs? Is the service accessible to a not right? Like or no? Like just. Or do Orthodox shuls assume that the only people who would walk in the door are already knowledgeable day school alumni, right? Observant, educated Orthodox Jews, and so there's no need to like kind of create a product that's relevant and appealing to the masses. I think the Orthodox shuls that people drive to, I think that's like a very special sort of institution. I think that's still preserving something of value that yes, we care about Shabbat, yes, we care about Jewish education, yes, we try for a certain elitist. Promoting a certain spiritual elitism and encouraging people to grow and to learn more and do more. But I think there's also a value in operating a synagogue life that can be relevant for the masses of American Jewry and that can be accessible to the masses of American Jewry, has something to say to them, is proud to serve as a resource to Jews of all kinds who might cross the threshold of the shul, right? So I think that's sort of the risk, or that's the negative side of sort of our communities being strong in this very committed core.
You're describing as somewhat insular Orthodoxy, because there was once a time, certainly my generation, where kids would go to Israel or to Ramah or other places, and they'd be unsatisfied when they'd come back, but the nearby Orthodox shul would be welcoming and would be a stepping stone. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those kids became quite from, a lot of kids that I grew up with, two synagogue presidents, as a matter of fact, both of whom were almost anti-religious reform.
Wow.
And so we're losing that.
Mhm.
I mean, when I saw this community 28 years ago, I saw a conservative synagogue across the street from the Orthodox one, and I just, in my head was like, oh, just like St. Louis, where I could walk across the street. Not these two schools. But that's what I mean. I think
Yeah.
we've lost that.
Yeah.
And a few page announcements and a few welcoming smiles would be a help. Because and I'm not saying we don't, but
Yeah, no,
It should be-
as in general, it's not that, yeah, I basically agree. I think it's a very small price to pay, to announce some pages to potentially expand the pool of who feels comfortable in your building, and not to make too many assumptions. There was there's a fellow who, in the first few months that I was working in Chicago, there's a fellow who came to Minyan every day, and he told me one Friday, I'm going to a bar mitzvah out of town. Again, I'm going to a mitzvah in Skokie. I'm not going to be here, on Shabbat. And then Friday night, I saw him in shul. So I walked up to him and I said, "Oh, like what happened? Like you're not going to bar mitzvah?" And he looked at me and said, "No, the mitzvah's tomorrow." And it was like, oh, it never occurred to me that somebody who would be at Chagres every morning, 7 mornings a week, would also be like driving to the cousin's bar mitzvah. But like, wow, but like that was on me, right? For not like having an expansive enough mind of like who is using that shul as a resource, who could, and who did I have responsibility to make sure they feel comfortable. And
it's him or his kids.
Yeah.
He ended up being the ones who, find.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So we're going to pick up the story. The next week is the most common. We're going to cram, I think 44 years into the next class. And we're going to sort of see how this cohesive community poised for success attains a great deal of success, but also comes into lots of conflict and or all sorts of issues of the last 40 years. That'll be the next class. Okay, so we're going to pack a lot in. So please come back and bring your friends. And thank you so much. And join us tomorrow, please, down the hall. Thank you.
Oh, this is a great class for them.
All right.